So this is our last presentation for today, and we have Michael Howes, who's been with us for the last 3-4 years now, I think, and he's going to present again about differential privacy. But we're now into this new realm where we're actually implementing differential privacy, and so I'm excited to hear how this is going from Michael Howes. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. Let me get my screen share here. Right. And Susan, can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, I can see your slides.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm actually in Albuquerque right now for tomorrow's meetings, so I wish we could all be in person today. But so I'm going to talk to you about our 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System, and in particular, our implementation of the Disclosure Avoidance System for the next of the major 2020 Census data products that'll be coming out, the Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, or DHC. I'll give you a bit of background about kind of why we were changing our disclosure avoidance system, like kind of what led to those decisions. I'll explain differential privacy, which is the framework that underlies the new disclosure avoidance system. I'll walk through the mechanics of the algorithm, the differentially private algorithm that we're using to protect the data in the DHC file. And then I'll talk about some of the resources that we've come up with and the schedule looking forward. So that's kind of the outline of what we're going to cover today. I think we have a small enough group that we can do this a little bit more kind of ad hoc. So if you have questions at all during my talk, feel free to just chime up. While I'm sharing my slides from my laptop anyway, I can't see if people raise their hands or put stuff in chat. So just somebody like flag me or like just raise your voice if you have a question. Also, I'm working from my hotel room here, and hotel Wi-Fi's can be iffy. So if at any point my audio or anything cuts out, again, just kind of chime in and I'll repeat what I said. Before I start, just a few acknowledgements. I want to thank all of our many collaborators and partners, both within the Census Bureau and amongst the research and academic communities that have contributed to all the information that's included in these slides. This really has been a group effort. More importantly, I want to thank all of our stakeholders, all of our data users that have contributed feedback and suggestions throughout this process. We would not have been able to do any of this without that amazing feedback from the people who matter most, and that's the people who use our data, like yourselves. Also, standard disclaimer, any opinions or viewpoints I express today are entirely my own. So data stewardship is incredibly important to the Census Bureau. Our ability to protect the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of our respondents' data is a legal obligation for us under Title 13, Sections 8B and 9, which require us to keep respondent information confidential and prohibit us from publishing anything that could reveal that personal information about our respondents. But more than just a legal obligation, this is also central to our ability to fulfill our mission to produce quality data in the first place. When the public entrusts their data to us, they're trusting that we're going to be able to adequately protect it. And if we're not able to live up to that trust, then people would be less willing to participate in censuses and surveys down the road. And so our ability to really collect and produce quality data hinges on our ability to protect the confidentiality of our respondents' data. Now, over the last century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the research, design, and implementation of a whole family of statistical methods that can be used to protect confidentiality when you're publicly releasing data products. And over the years, as the threats and the vulnerabilities of census data to re-identification, which we're going to talk more about in a minute, have increased, we've had to increase and modify and improve those statistical safeguards to keep pace. And our adoption of differentially private methods for the 2020 census is really just the latest in what has been a long history of continuous evolution and improvement along these lines. So the real challenge that we have to address is that every time you release any statistic or any piece of information that's derived from an underlying confidential data source, like the census, releasing that statistic or releasing that data point is going to reveal or leak a tiny amount of confidential information in the process. Now, normally that amount of confidential information is trivial, that you can't pull out anything specific about any particular individual from national level statistics very easily. But when you increase the amount and the detail of those statistics, and if you publish enough of them, eventually you're going to reveal enough confidential information across all those statistics that you could reveal all of the underlying confidential data. And so this has been known kind of in theory since the 1970s. The federal government has acknowledged that the release of any data product carries disclosure risk. It was proved mathematically in the early 2000s. And as you'll see later in this presentation, we also demonstrated it empirically through some recent simulated attacks on the 2010 census. But the bottom line here is that if you release too many statistics too accurately, you're going to reveal the underlying confidential data. And that's what we're trying to protect and prevent. And this effort is increasingly difficult with each passing year. Because, as I said, any data release carries some risk of disclosure, but the threat landscape is not staying still. Improvements in computing power, the explosion and proliferation of rich third-party data sources that could be used in an attack are increasing with each year. And the combination of those means that with each passing year, the vulnerability of the data products that we're releasing increases, and we have to keep pace with that. Excuse me. Now, historically, most efforts to protect confidentiality in publicly released data have really focused on preventing what are known as re-identification attacks. And these primarily focus on microdata product releases. Think a PUMS file, like a public use microdata sample, or other data products where you're releasing individual level records. These were always seen as being the most vulnerable to attack because the most common vector of attack here is what's known as a re-identification attack. And that happens when you have some confidential data, like we were showing on the right, think a PUMS file, that doesn't have any direct identifiers on it, but that has various characteristics of the individuals reflected in the data, like their location, their age, and their sex. But an attacker could take that information, that published data product, and link it to some third-party data source that shared those same characteristics about individuals. Essentially, the common linking variables here being that location, age, and sex. And by doing so, they could then reattach names to those quote-unquote anonymized data records that were included in the public data product. And by doing so, you now know Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status. You've correctly re-identified them from an otherwise anonymized data product that was released. And so this is the kind of the most common vector of attack that most approaches to protecting data products have really focused on trying to mitigate. In the 1970 and the 1980 censuses, the primary mechanism for doing this was suppression, where we would suppress records from what was published. We would suppress cells or even entire tables in what we were releasing. And this resulted in what I like to call kind of Swiss cheese data, where you're losing a lot of detail about particularly small geographies, small communities, etc. Obviously, this made data users' jobs difficult because we didn't have complete coverage of communities across the country because of those suppressions. So beginning with the 1990 census, we started switching to a form of noise infusion to protect the data that relied on swapping households. So rather than suppressing records, suppressing communities that weren't large enough to adequately protect, we would publish all of the data, but we would move entire households around in an attempt to introduce uncertainty in the data to protect confidentiality. And we use that kind of swapping approach for the 1990, 2000, and 2010 censuses. But the challenge here is that the light touch approach to disclosure avoidance that had been used for the tabular data products, which were often seen as less vulnerable to re-identification attacks than microdata releases. Those light touch or lighter touch approaches to disclosure avoidance were premised on the idea that tabular data products are less vulnerable than microdata products are. And historically, that had often been the case, but improvements in computing power have kind of changed the landscape. We now have to be concerned about what are known as reconstruction embedded attacks. Now, a reconstruction here is essentially the recreation of individual level data from aggregate or tabular data releases. And you can think of this kind of like a giant game of Sudoku. If you're familiar with Sudoku puzzles, I'm showing on the right-hand side of the screen here, if you're familiar with Sudoku, if there's enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, well, then there's going to be one and only one solution to the puzzle. Well, the same holds true when you're publishing aggregate data tables. If you release enough data tables that have enough kind of characteristics combined and crossed with each other, eventually there's going to be one and only one set of underlying individual level records that could have produced all of those aggregate tabular statistics. Now, this might seem like a Herculean task to try to solve for that underlying microdata, but computer algorithms can now do this quite easily. It's been said that any kind of aspiring computer science undergraduate student with access to a cloud computing platform could perform this kind of attack on prior census data. So this is theoretically very easy to perform if you have the computing power to do so. So with this idea that reconstruction embedded attacks meant that tabular data products had to be thought of as more akin to their microdata counterparts, and we had to treat them as kind of the same type of data release and requiring the same level of protections. We decided to perform our own simulated attack on the 2010 census to see, well, okay, just how well were those swapping mechanisms that we used in the 2010 census tabular releases, how effective were those at protecting against re-identification in this kind of reconstruction embedded attack environment? Now, the 2010 census collected a handful of pieces of information, such as location, age, sex, race, ethnicity, and relationship status for the approximately 309 million individuals that were enumerated in the country. That gave us about 1.9 billion confidential data points that we had to protect. But the 2010 census data products, the suite of data products, released over 150 billion, with a B, statistics that were derived from those 1.9 billion confidential data points. That's the richness of census data products, is that we're providing tabulations and cross-tabulations by all sorts of characteristics in all sorts of different ways at different levels of geography. So we're releasing a huge number of statistics, all derived from that same much smaller underlying set of confidential data. So we ran an internal experiment, an internal simulated attack, to see if that quantity of statistics was sufficient to essentially re-identify specific individuals from the published 2010 census data products. And unfortunately, the results confirmed an emphatic yes to that question. We were, in fact, able to accurately reconstruct the underlying microdata records of the 2010 census, and we were able to re-identify specific individuals. In fact, using only a small portion of the published tables from the 2010 census, we were able to reconstruct all 309 million records in the census. We were able to link those records to commercially available data from the time period. And then we were able to confirm that in doing so, we had accurately re-identified about 17% of the US population, or about 52 million people. And so for those confirmed re-identifications, an attacker would correctly learn the race and ethnicity of those individuals. If we had expanded this simulated attack to include other tables, they could have also learned relationship status and household composition, same-sex couples, multiracial households, etc. This was a proof of concept simulated attack, and the results were alarming in this regard. So with that knowledge in mind, the Census Bureau kind of had to make a decision. The simulated attack kind of proved that the protections that we had been using for our tabular data products, our aggregate data products for 2010 and earlier, were growing increasingly insufficient to protect confidentiality in the face of these new vectors of possible confidentiality attack. So to meet our continuing obligations to safeguard respondent information, we decided that we had to modernize our approach to performing disclosure avoidance on the data that we were going to publish. And that led us to our adoption of differential privacy for the 2020 census. But to understand differential privacy, it's helpful to understand how disclosure avoidance methods writ large operate. So disclosure avoidance, as I said, is a whole family of statistical tools that you can use to try to make reconstruction and re-identification attacks more difficult. And they work by doing one or more of three basic things. They either seek to reduce the precision of the data that you're releasing. They can seek to remove vulnerable records, those most at risk of re-identification, or they can seek to add uncertainty in the data, essentially reducing an attacker's confidence that they've correctly re-identified somebody. And historically, kind of traditionally used mechanisms of disclosure avoidance have included things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with from your use of census data and other data sources. These include things like suppression, either primary or complementary suppression, rounding of data that are being published, recoding extreme values at the top or bottom ends of the distribution, sampling from a larger distribution like a PUMS file, swapping records like we used for the 2000 and 2010 censuses, or other forms of noise injection. And these methods have been used for decades as in an attempt to, again, do those one or more of those three things on the left that make re-identification attacks more challenging. But the problem with any approach to disclosure avoidance is that any statistical technique that you use to protect privacy is going to impose a fundamental trade-off between the degree or strength of your privacy protection on the one hand and the resulting accuracy, availability, or fitness for use of the data on the other. This isn't a side effect of disclosure avoidance. It's actually how disclosure avoidance works. Remember, if you release too many statistics too accurately, you're going to reveal the underlying data. Disclosure avoidance makes re-identification more difficult by reducing either the quantity or the accuracy of the data that are being released in an attempt to kind of keep the genie in the bottle, keep the confidential data protected. So you have this fundamental trade-off in disclosure avoidance, in any kind of disclosure avoidance. And how you manage that trade-off is done through the parameters of your implementation of disclosure avoidance. And those are things like your swap rates, your noise injection parameters, your self-suppression thresholds, and so on. They determine how strong your protection or how accurate the data will be. But most traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance provide very little ability to really quantify confidentiality protection. It's a very subjective process with most of these methods that's been likened to kind of the occult sciences by some commentators, because these traditional disclosure avoidance methods don't allow you to really measure and track disclosure risk particularly across multiple data releases that all come from the same confidential data source. So you might have a fairly good idea about how well your protections in a particular table are, and you might know how good your protections for a different table are, but it's very difficult to assess the interaction of those two tables. How strong are your privacy protections when an attacker has access to both of those tables, for example? So when faced with evidence of rising risks of disclosure, practitioners of disclosure avoidance, these statistical methods, have known that they needed to adjust their implementation parameters, usually by dialing up those parameters, increasing your swap rates, increasing your cell suppression thresholds, etc. But again, without this ability to really quantify and track and account for privacy risk across multiple releases, these adjustments in parameters have historically been largely scattershot solutions that result in overprotecting some data, making it less usable, while at the same time underprotecting the most vulnerable records, those who are most easily re-identified. And so this has been a real problem, and it's one that practitioners of disclosure avoidance have struggled with for decades. Which brings us to differential privacy, which is one of a whole kind of family of what are known as formal privacy approaches. Differential privacy is not a disclosure avoidance method the same way that suppression or rounding is a disclosure avoidance method, as much as differential privacy is a privacy risk accounting framework that allows you to define and quantify confidentiality protection in any particular release and to be able to track it across multiple releases. And it does this by essentially knowing that every individual, every data subject that's reflected in a particular statistic is going to contribute towards that statistic's value. And you also know that every statistic that you publish is going to reveal or leak a tiny amount of private information about the individuals that are reflected in that statistic. So differential privacy as this kind of privacy risk accounting framework allows you to assess each individual's potential contribution to each statistic you want to release. And by assessing and measuring this, it then allows you to limit through some form of noise injection how much actual information about those individuals will be revealed in that resulting statistic. It allows you to really quantify each individual's kind of place in the statistic and then to protect it. And so, as I said, using kind of this privacy accounting framework with a form of disclosure avoidance based on noise injection, differentially private approaches allow you to precisely control that trade-off between degree of protection and the usability of the data. This offers a number of really important advantages. It's infinitely tunable. The parameters of differentially private implementations, you could think of them as dials or levers on a control board, for example, can be set anywhere on the spectrum from perfect privacy at the one extreme to perfect data accuracy on the other. And by quantifying this, that you can provide mathematical proofs, mathematical guarantees of the degree of confidentiality protection that the resulting data will have. And when compared with kind of the ad hoc and scattershot approaches of prior decades, you can get greater protection for the same level of accuracy, or greater accuracy for the same level of protection, whichever way you want to look at it, compared to those earlier methods. Central to those parameters, I mentioned differential privacy has all these kind of parameters and dials that you can set to determine that trade-off. Central to those parameters are what's known as privacy loss budgets. So what is a privacy loss budget? Well, as I mentioned before, any disclosure avoidance mechanism is going to impose this fundamental trade-off between degree of protection, your confidentiality guarantee on the one hand, and the resulting accuracy and fitness for use of the data on the other. And you can think of this as a spectrum, going from one extreme where you've got perfect confidentiality and absolutely useless data at that one extreme, to you have perfect data with absolutely no confidentiality protections at all at the other extreme. That would be releasing the confidential records directly. Now, you don't want to be at either end of the extreme. We have legal obligations to protect confidentiality. We have our mission to produce quality data. We need to find somewhere in between those extremes where the data are sufficiently protected to meet our legal and ethical obligations to our data subjects, while also being sufficiently accurate to meet our data users' needs. Now, that's a bit subjective, and that's a policy decision, and you can argue kind of how much protection is necessary. You can argue how accurate is accurate enough. But once you've found that sweet spot, once you've found that sufficiently protected and sufficiently accurate sweet spot on this continuum, that becomes known as your privacy loss budget. Essentially, that's the point at which you set the dial. And you'll hear privacy loss budgets abbreviated as either PLB or by various Greek letters, depending on which differential privacy or formal privacy framework you're using, the most common being either the Greek letter epsilon or the Greek letter rho. And so that determines the strength of your protection, determines how accurate the resulting data are going to be writ large. It determines how you're going to set your major parameter for your data protection. Now, there is no one way to implement differential privacy. As I said, differential privacy is an accounting framework, not a particular method. And so you can use all sorts of different approaches to kind of implementing confidentiality protection within a differentially private accounting framework. So for the 2020 census, because of the kind of different characteristics of the different data products that we're producing, the Census Bureau is actually going to be using a variety of algorithms, all based on differential privacy, to protect the different data products that we're going to be releasing. The kind of first set of data products that have been going out the door and that will go out the door are the redistricting data summary file. That was the PL94-171 file that went out last summer. And then the upcoming releases of the demographic profile and demographic and housing characteristics file, or DHC. Those are being protected by one differentially private algorithm known as the top-down algorithm, or TDA, which I'm going to be explaining more in a minute. But the TDA essentially works by ingesting the confidential data and then outputting privacy protected microdata, individual level records that can then be ingested into the decennial census tabulation systems to produce the tables that you know and love. The subsequent data products for the 2020 census, including what are known as the detailed DHC-A, detailed DHC-B, and the supplemental DHC that provide much greater detail on the write-in race and ethnicity categories, Indian tribes and villages, and the household characteristics in the supplemental DHC. Those are being protected by a different set of algorithms that skip that microdata step and essentially produce privacy protected tabulations directly. So you input the confidential microdata and you output data tables that have their confidentiality protections in place. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about the top-down algorithm because that's what we're using. That's what we used for the redistricting data, and that's what we're using for the upcoming DHC data release. But I'm also happy to answer some questions about the subsequent algorithms if you have them. So when essentially charging the DAS team with kind of the creation of a new and improved disclosure avoidance system for the 2020 census, the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, which is the governing board that oversees how we do confidentiality protection in our data, they set a number of system requirements. And some of those are really important for how the algorithm was designed. The first was, DSEP said that the disclosure avoidance system needed for the redistricting data and for the DHC, the disclosure avoidance system needed to input the confidential microdata and output protected microdata. So you have the microdata in and protected microdata out. Beyond that, the system also had to be able to establish certain what are known as invariants. And those are statistics for which no noise is added, where essentially the statistic reflects the exact enumerated count for that characteristic. And for the case of the 2020 census, those invariants included the total state population and the number and type of occupied group quarters facilities at the block level, and the number of housing units at the block level. So those were held exactly as enumerated in all of the published data. Those were invariant in the processing, and the system had to be able to protect to keep those from having any noise injected. Furthermore, the injection of noise can't kind of conflict with the edit constraints and structural zeros that are present in the editing of the confidential microdata. Things like you can't have a 5-year-old grandmother, you can't have a 100-year-old who's the child of another householder, essentially. Things where it's an impossible situation, a structural zero where the coding of the census edited file wouldn't permit it. The disclosure avoidance system can't allow those kinds of impossible or structural zeros to occur either. Most importantly, DCEP, the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, said that the system needed to be tunable. That DCEP was going to make the decisions about where on that spectrum between those two extremes, where on that privacy accuracy spectrum, the resulting data were going to be. They were going to specify that, and the system had to allow DCEP to essentially maneuver those dials to find that proper balance. The system also had to guarantee that as you increase the privacy loss budget towards greater accuracy, if you increase it to infinity, it would spit the underlying confidential data out, essentially meaning that you have kind of that perfect tracking of the privacy loss budget from 0 to infinity. And in contrast with prior disclosure avoidance methods that have often operated kind of in a black box and without much in the way of transparency to our data users in terms of the effects of disclosure avoidance on data usability, there was a fundamental requirement here that everything that we were doing with the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System had to be fully transparent. And so we committed to sharing all of our implementation code, sharing all of the parameters, et cetera, so that our data users can go in and see exactly what we're doing and know what the impact on the data is going to be. So how does the top-down algorithm work? Well, at a very high level, it inputs the confidential microdata from the census, known as the census edited file, or CEF, along with our geographic reference file, which is the accompanying geographies. It inputs those into the algorithm. It converts those microdata records into what's known as a histogram, and I'll talk more about that in a second. It injects noise into a set of tabulations drawn from those data. It then post-processes those noisy measurements into an internally and hierarchically consistent histogram, and it then converts that privacy-protected histogram back into microdata that can feed into the decennial census tabulation systems. Now, there were probably a lot of things that I just said that made no sense to you, and so let me walk through what each of those steps means in a little bit of greater detail. So the first is, what is a histogram? It's not, if you're thinking back to high school or college statistics, it's not the histograms that you know and love from your statistics 101 class. This is a histogram in the computer science sense. And essentially what it does is it means that you're converting microdata, which are one record per respondent forms of data, into a record count for each unique combination of attributes, including location. So it's a functional equivalent of microdata, but it's in a way that essentially operates as a fully saturated cross-tabulation or a fully saturated contingency table of all of the possible attributes in the data. And then you get record counts for each of those combinations. And the importance here is that it's much easier to do your noise injection to these record counts of attribute combinations than it is to do noise injection into individual level records. So it converts the microdata into this functionally equivalent histogram of record counts. And then the algorithm injects noise into those histogram counts. So the top-down algorithm, allocates shares of the total privacy loss budget to different cross-tabulations that we're performing at different levels of geography, so national level versus state level versus tract level, et cetera, and by different queries, so different sets of cross-tabulations that we're doing. And so it asks these queries of the underlying confidential data. The result comes back, might say that there's 5 records that have a particular combination of characteristics, and then it'll inject either 0 noise or plus or minus 1 person or plus or minus 2 people, etc. The amount of noise is taken from an underlying probability distribution that centers on 0, and with the variance, the spread of that distribution, determined by how much privacy loss budget is allocated to that particular query at that particular geographic level. Now, it's important to note that all of these kind of noisy measurements are independent of each other. So you might take a measure of total population at the county level, and then take a measure of total number of males at the county level and total number of females at the county level. And you're going to have three different amounts of noise added to those three statistics, which would then mean that your males plus females might not add to your total number of, like, the total population count for that county, because the noise is all independent. And so this can mean that you might have some inconsistencies. When you're dealing with really small counts, it could also mean that you might have some negative values. If there were 0 individuals with a particular combination of characteristics, and you inject -1 in terms of noise, now you suddenly have -1 individuals, which doesn't make any sense. So after we've taken all these noisy measurements, we need to post-process those noisy measurements to make them consistent, to make sure that all of the subcharacteristics add up to the larger group characteristic, that child geographies like individual census blocks add up to their block groups add up to tracts, etc. So we have to do post-processing to make the data consistent. And that's where the top-down component of the top-down algorithm comes into play. So the algorithm operates along what's known as a geographic hierarchy, starting at the entire US level and then moving its way down kind of layers of the hierarchy until you get down to the individual census blocks. And at each level of that hierarchy, the algorithm takes kind of a set of inputs. It takes the noisy measurements, it takes the invariance, and it takes any constraints. And constraints are things like, you can think of them as the edit constraints that I was discussing before, or it could be results that were achieved at a higher geographic level. So it takes the noisy measurements and the invariance and any constraints that may apply, and it finds an internally consistent hierarchy, internally consistent histogram for that level of geography that matches those requirements, that comes closest to the individual noisy measurements, but that also respects the invariance and constraints. Then once you have that kind of internally consistent hierarchy at the United States level, then you go down to the individual state levels, and the totals established at the US level are added to the set of constraints that have to be optimized in the hierarchy, so that all of the state attribute counts, for example, like number of males in each state will add up to the number of males in the US, number of females in each state will add up to the number of females in the US, etc. At each level of the hierarchy, the prior kind of upper levels of the hierarchy are added to the constraints that the algorithm has to respect. Now, the hierarchy becomes important here because there's not just a single way that you can go from the entire US level all the way down to census blocks. Now, we have a standard tabulation hierarchy that you're familiar with from census data products, and that's things like US to state to county to tract to block group to block. But in some cases, data users are not terribly interested in block groups in and of themselves or blocks in and of themselves. They're interested in those geographies because they want to use them to aggregate to other geographies of interest, like towns and places and minor civil divisions, American Indian, Alaska Native tribal areas and reservations. So we realized that we could achieve greater accuracy for the geographies that many of our data users cared about if we modified the hierarchy that the top-down algorithm uses from kind of the traditional tabulation hierarchy to a kind of algorithm-specific processing hierarchy. And so, for example, with the redistricting data product, we added kind of a parallel spine for American Indian and Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian areas, essentially separating out in those states that have AIA-NH areas, separating out the AIA-NH areas from the remainder of their states, and then processing those two kind of portions of the state separately from the state level all the way down to individual blocks. That's the diagram shown in the middle here. We also realized that block group boundaries in the kind of traditional kind of operational and tabulation hierarchy don't really correspond very well with some of the lower level geographies that people are really interested in. Again, like minor civil divisions, places, towns, neighborhoods, etc. So for the purposes of the algorithm's processing, we kind of moved some of those block group boundaries around a little bit. We optimized them in order to bring their boundaries closer to the boundaries of the geographies that people care about. Minor civil divisions, places, AIN areas, etc. Because by doing so, we were able to get greater accuracy for those geographies that people cared about. Now, I should stress these changes to the hierarchy are only for the purposes of post-processing within the algorithm. It doesn't affect how the data are tabulated and published. All of the data tables that you know are going to be published using the traditional tabulation hierarchies that as they have in the past. Now, those were things that we did for the algorithm for the redistricting data. For the demographic and housing characteristics data, the DHC, which is coming out next summer, or next spring, I should say, the algorithm's geographic hierarchy was further modified to include the primitive geographies that are used in the Census Bureau's population estimates program. Now, population estimates primitive geographies are essentially the most granular geographic areas that are required in order to derive the tables for every geography for which population estimates are produced. And these population estimates primitive geographies form a complete lattice across the country. So it's a mutually exclusive partition of the US, to use the scientific term. And so those were added in to the algorithm's geographic hierarchy so that we were taking queries at those levels and processing down that hierarchy from like county to these population estimates geographies to subsets of tracts within those primitive geographies, then down to the optimized block groups and to the blocks. And this essentially helped us increase accuracy for those geographies that are kind of core to a lot of demographic use cases and population estimates use cases. Now, I've talked a lot about queries. The top-down algorithm only takes noisy measurements for defined queries or defined tabulations at particular geographic levels. So adjusting those queries and or adjusting the share of privacy loss budget that's assigned to those individual queries then determines kind of the resulting amount of noise that's injected into the statistics that are derived from those. And so this is where there's a lot of tuning that can be done within the algorithm. Throwing more, like a larger share of privacy loss budget at, for example, Hispanic by sex queries will increase the resulting accuracy of those data. Throwing more privacy loss budget at county level statistics rather than at block level statistics, for example, will increase the resulting accuracy of the county level data. And so this is where you can move privacy loss budget around. You can adjust your query strategies in an attempt to find that optimal balance of confidentiality protection on the one hand and data accuracy and usability for the other. And this was a group effort kind of doing this tuning, and I'll talk more about how stakeholder feedback played into this in a moment. But this really was kind of an iterative and collaborative process of finding the best shares of privacy loss budget to go to these different sets of queries at different levels of geography. Now, the top-down approach of the top-down algorithm has a number of real kind of benefits when you compare it to kind of other possible implementations of differential privacy for these data, particularly with kind of naive alternatives like a block by block or a bottom-up approach to protecting confidentiality. Kind of key among those advantages is that the disclosure limitation error, the amount of noise that's added in to statistics, does not increase with the number of census blocks that are included in any geography of interest that you want to study. So as you aggregate contiguous blocks together, you're not compounding the error of those blocks, you're actually canceling it out. So any block group level data is going to be more accurate than the similar statistics for the blocks underneath it. Track level data will be more accurate than the block group data, and so on. And this is kind of a fundamental characteristic of official statistics, that the larger the population you're measuring, the more accurate your statistic could be. And the top-down approach to this allowed us to achieve that. Also, it allowed us to better manage the privacy loss budget, because this top-down approach essentially borrows strength or inherits accuracy from higher levels of the geographic hierarchy. So, for example, if you know that a particular combination of characteristics at the state level has a very small number of people, let's say there's 10 individuals that share some unusual combination of characteristics at the state level. Well, then when you're injecting noise into the statistics below that state level, the algorithm constrains those lower geographic level statistics to add up to that 10. So you can't end up with more people. And this was a real improvement, because essentially it deals with kind of one of the real challenges of protecting census data, which is sparsity. There's a lot of very small cell counts in census data, a lot of zeros, a lot of ones, a lot of twos, when you're dealing with kind of all of the possible combinations of attributes and characteristics that are reflected in the census. And so this kind of borrowing strength from higher levels yields substantial accuracy gains compared with other possible implementations of noise infusion here. Okay, so I mentioned before that the selection of privacy loss budget and the allocation of privacy loss budget by geographic level and by query is really an iterative and collaborative process, or has been for us. Over the past 3 years, the Census Bureau has released 8 different sets of what we have called demonstration data products. These were data products that were generated by running 2010 census data through various iterations of our 2020 census top-down algorithm. And essentially doing so allowed our data users to compare the output of the top-down algorithm, the differentially private versions of the 2010 data, to the results that were published after the 2010 census that were protected using swapping. And you could compare and contrast what different settings of the privacy loss budget and the query strategy and so on, what those meant in terms of relative accuracy of certain statistics over others. And with each set of these demonstration data, we got substantial feedback in from our data users, many of you as well, and from our advisory committees. We did formal tribal consultations with American Indian, Alaska Native tribal leaders, and so on. And we got all this feedback and analysis back. And with each iteration, that feedback, that stakeholder engagement, allowed us to improve our implementation parameters, better tune our algorithms, and adjust them to help ensure that the final production settings that will be used to actually protect the 2020 census, well, the redistricting data that we released last year and the DHC that's coming out, that we will ensure that those meet your needs. Okay, so where are we in the process? Okay, so last year in April, the apportionment data that had no noise infused into it, those were the 51 counts of state populations for each state in the country and the District of Columbia. Those were released in April. The redistricting data file, which was protected using the top-down algorithm, was released in August of 2021. Next on deck are the demographic profiles and demographic and housing characteristics files, or the DHC. Those are scheduled for release in May of 2023. And then following the release of the DHC in August of 2023 and beyond are the remaining major data products for the 2020 census, the detailed DHC-A, the detailed DHC-B, and the supplemental DHC. There will then eventually, we'll turn our attention to kind of out-year uses of census data, including a PUMS file and special tabulations, etc. But here are the kind of the main suite of data products that we're currently looking at with their schedules. Shown graphically, this is the development and production schedule for the DHC. You can see in the gray blocks above the timeline, that's all of the stakeholder feedback periods that we've had along this process, all of the stakeholder engagement and input and analysis that we've gotten from our data users that have helped us in our decision making, helped us in our algorithm design and implementation. We are now in the final processing stage. So a couple weeks ago, the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee met, and based on the feedback from the last set of demonstration data, made the final production settings decisions, the parameter settings for the production run of the DHC in the top-down algorithm. We are now in the period where the production run is going through the algorithm. It will then go through extensive quality assurance in our demographic directorates and decennial directorate. Then tabulations, and then ultimately in May of 2023, the DHC data product will be released. Okay, so I've covered a lot of information. If you want to learn more about anything we're doing, if you want to stay kind of current on our work to modernize disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census and ultimately for our other censuses and surveys, I highly recommend you subscribe to our newsletter. We send out updates every couple of weeks or so on average, and that's always your best bet for kind of up-to-date information on what we are doing. We also have been partnering with the Population Reference Bureau to come up with a variety of types of guidance for our data users to understand what we're doing with disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census and to understand what its implications might be for your uses of census data. The first of these efforts was a handbook that we released last fall titled Disclosure Avoidance for the 2020 Census and Introduction. This gives kind of a more detailed overview of everything that I talked about today with the top-down algorithm and discusses some of the implications for your uses of census data. Feedback on this handbook was extensive. A lot of data users found this to be really helpful, but we also got a lot of requests for more targeted informational materials. So we are working with PRB to develop a series of shorter, kind of more succinct issue briefs on various aspects of our disclosure avoidance system and various aspects of kind of implications. We're also working to develop a suite of statistical methods and guidance for data users on how to leverage kind of the known behavior of differentially private noise infusion into your uses of census data, essentially how you could use the known kind of patterns of error that are used to protect privacy to improve the accuracy of your population projections, et cetera, how you could use margins of uncertainty, margins of error, confidence intervals, and so on. We'll be releasing the first of that guidance out this spring in advance of the DHC release. You can visit our website. We have tons of resources available there, including webinars, issue briefs, videos, frequently asked questions, and so on. Just search disclosure avoidance on www.census.gov. And if you need to be able to kind of explain some of this to some of your colleagues or those who have not been following along, we have a great kind of introductory video that we put together. It's called Protecting Privacy and Census Bureau Statistics that gives a really high-level overview of how differential privacy works. And that's available both on our website and on our YouTube page. And with that, I am going to pause and stop sharing my screen so that I can answer some questions, which I'm sure some of you have.
So I'm just going to speak up for a minute because I've been following differential privacy pretty close, and I've been on some of the meetings where a lot of our state data center compatriots and other states in the network have downloaded those demonstration products and actually done runs on it. And I'll say at the beginning of this process, when I first heard they were going to use differential privacy back in 2017, it was stunning to me, and I was totally against it. Over the last 5 years, I think my point has changed a view on this, and mostly because the Census Bureau and a lot of the work in the differential privacy group has been to bring in the state data centers and ask us, well, here's our products. Based on the 2010, what do you see is wrong? And we were able to give feedback that has gotten me to the point that I feel, given the fact that we can look up and see, all right, there's a certain amount of injected noise here, that the data is as accurate as we got from 2010. So when we go out to look at our 2020 data and you're looking at, if you dive all the way down to those below census tracts to block groups. Yeah, ACS, we've always had large margins of error in those areas, and yet it's still valuable. And I have this sort of confidence that, yeah, there's still some spots in New Mexico where we have issues, and we're going to look at the number and say, it doesn't work for us. But by and large, I think most areas it is going to work for us. And I just wanted to give that, a shout out to Michael, because he's been out here talking about the whole thing through this whole process. And I think, 5 years down, I actually have a larger sense of confidence in, one, the transparency that has gone through in this program, and two, that the response and the fixes that they have done to differential privacy have really been in the right direction. So I just wanted to give you my 2 cents there.
Thank you. And I'm going to flip that around and say, like, we could not have done this without the amazing feedback that we got from the SDC network, from the CIC network, from the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of policy decisions that have to be made in setting these parameters. There's no right way to do it. And finding the optimal set of parameters, the optimal balance, was something we couldn't have done without the enormous amount of really constructive feedback and criticism, I will say, that we've gotten from the data user community over the last several years, and that's been greatly appreciated and factored heavily in all the decision making.
Do any of you guys have any of those pressing questions that you want to put us on the hot seat today? And if you don't think of them now, it's okay. You can ask them tomorrow.
Bianca.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious if you have any sense of how this method of privacy has affected the data compared to previous years. If you're seeing, real differences in any of it.
So it's a tough question to answer, because one of the drawbacks of the approach to disclosure avoidance that we used for prior decades, the swapping algorithm, is that we have to keep all of the kind of parameters of the implementation and its impact on the data confidential, because you could reverse engineer the unprotected data by knowing those parameters. So internally, we know what the impacts of swapping were on data usability, but those impacts were largely opaque to our data users, because those assessments are also Title 13 protected. I think it's important to note that when doing comparisons, like with the demonstration data, as Susan was mentioning, when doing the comparisons of the differentially private versions to the published tabulations, you're actually seeing both sets of noise in there, because you're comparing the differentially private data, which were generated off of the confidential microdata. You're comparing those to the swapped published data. And so you're like, when you see that like 2 numbers don't stack up, that could be due to swapping, or it could be due to differential privacy, or it could be due to some combination thereof. So it was really kind of important for us that as we got a lot of feedback, as data users were identifying places where they were observing either an excessive amount of noise in particular statistics that would render their uses difficult, or where they were seeing unusual patterns in the noise, like biases or kind of artifacts of how the algorithm was doing things, we would rerun many of those analyses on our internal files against the unswapped data, to make sure that if people were identifying things that were problems, that it was something due to differential privacy, not something that was due to the swapping. And sometimes we were finding that it was because of the swapping, not because of the DP. I think in terms of kind of the basic answer to your question, block level data are going to be more noisy than they were in 2010. And that's by design. That's as some of my colleagues would say, that's a feature, not a bug, because that's where the privacy challenges are the greatest, and that's where we needed to concentrate our efforts. In comparison, though, we went to enormous effort to make sure that as you aggregate blocks, even to very small aggregate geographies, as you aggregate those blocks together, you get reliable results. That was critical for the redistricting use case. It's critical for a lot of like city planning and town planning. So your block level data are going to be noisy. They're going to be noisy atoms or noisy pixels in your analysis. But as you build the geographies that you're actually interested in from those blocks, you'll get comparable accuracy to prior decades.
Thank you.
So blocks are noisy, but census tracts are good.
We also went to great efforts. So based on feedback we got from the most recent sets of demonstration data, we did a lot to also bring school districts, primary and secondary school districts, unified school districts closer to the spine as well. So a lot of effort was made to make sure that as you aggregate blocks into those types of geographies, school districts, minor civil divisions, towns, places, those will increase in accuracy quite rapidly.
Cool. I want to thank you all for hanging through with us all the way to the end today. And we're going to turn you loose and let you have the rest of your afternoon. And I look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing some of you in person tomorrow as well. So.